Hello, Mary.
Excellent.
Welcome to the show.
Hi, Lian. Nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As I
Mm.
was telling you, this definitely, I mean, there's always a personal interest in any of the conversations I have, but there's a particularly kind of burning passion kind of level of interest I've got in the work that you're doing. So, yeah, this is a real treat for me. So I know quite a bit about your background, your story, having watched your film, which I'd really recommend to listeners to go watch after this. But I would love for listeners to hear how you've ended up doing the work, which is, quite unusual, really. How you ended up doing what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, it's quite a long and winding story, but I can try and give you a brief synopsis of it anyway. I grew up on a small farm in the southeast of Ireland, and uh, I suppose I had a very strong connection with nature when I was young. I had an experience in a field which kind of formed the basis of my understanding of the sort of understanding of the life that exists, consciousness that exists in everything. Um, and I kind of forgot about all that when I was a bit older, obviously, kind of parties and all that sort of thing when you're a teenager. And I didn't really know what I was up to in life. And then my mum insisted I went to college because it was kind of part of what we had to do as kids. And, it was kind of understood that that was part of our job, and it was very kind of her to put me in that position. I was the youngest of six kids, so at that point she could have given up altogether, but she didn't. And so, so she, so I didn't know what I wanted to do in college, but I fancied a guy doing landscape design in Dublin in UCD, and I thought, oh, sure, I might as well go there. So, and hence that was the reasoning behind me joining that career of choice. And 2 weeks into the course, that was the end of that. And I kept going with the course anyway. So so I finished the degree and I set up business and started designing gardens straight away. And I did that for a few years and I was a really good designer, but I was gradually losing the will to live because people, changed their minds depending on what television program they'd seen the night before. And I wasn't very good at bossing people around, or I hadn't really discovered who I truly was yet, so I just do what anyone asked me to do, kind of thing. It was easily led as a designer, and I could design any kind of a style as such. But um, then I kind of had a dream one night when I moved back to the countryside from the city, and the dream was basically um, it was me being a crow. And I was flying above the landscape, and it was an ancient landscape, and it was clothed in the earth's choice of our own clothes. It was an ancient mixed, you know, ponds and lakes and rivers and little trickly streams, slivers of silver from way up high, and meadows and scrubby areas and ancient woodlands. And I heard my name being called, and so I dived down through the air into these woods. And then as I came through the trees, I saw, you know, what I look like now, but I was painted blue, sitting on a log looking up at myself as a crow, kind of
Wow.
grinning. And it's kind of like everything froze and I froze, and then everything sort of I got sucked back into this reality and I woke up. But it was a very simple thing, but it was like a key turning in my head, and I realized that nature was the real deal and gardens were just a poor version of her. And so
Mm.
I set about trying to understand how can I explain that to people. And clients wouldn't let me do it because I wasn't very good at bossing them around. And so I thought the best thing to do would be to go to the Chelsea Flower Show, which is the only kind of flower show I'd heard about at the time in London. And so I did. I went there, and that was um, a great story in itself. And then and that's the one that got made into that movie Dare to Be Wild that you referred to. Um, and then that kind of set me off on a curve of working all over the world, um, as a designer and living the dream. But
So when you
then
were
somebody went,
designing gardens then, like after the Chelsea Flower Show, was there more of a kind of honoring the wild within the designs, or did it still feel that you weren't did you still feel that you weren't fully able to honor that?
yeah, well, I had to, well, no, I was designing gardens that were wild,
Mm,
as in they were full of native plants, um,
mm,
and um, and they were kind of interwoven with stories and intention. Um,
mm,
However, when I decided to write a book of the real story of the film, like which was much more interesting, and then I got bored of doing that when the movie was coming out, and I started writing about my work. And I realized that even though I was designing gardens within the shapes and patterns of nature, and they were in harmony with the flow of energy, you know, the universal energy which flows through everything wasn't blocked because I was using shapes and patterns, from nature. So everything flowed. But the land itself didn't want to stay as I had directed it. It had its own intentions, and um,
mm,
it knew what it wanted to become, and I hadn't a clue. And I kept maintaining it and forcing it back into a box. And so I wrote my first book about, okay, how do you actually work with land and old ways of magic and mystery and um, you know, working with intention and a gentle kind of approach to how we design our landscapes and feed ourselves at the same
mm.
time. So that that was that. And then one morning I was sitting at my desk in about 2019, I think it was. Um, no, it was 2018, the winter of 2018. And um, I was looking down over my lawn, and a fox ran past and two hares chasing the fox, which was kind of, wrong. And it grasped my attention. And then I thought, I'll keep watching to see if they reemerge. And then I saw a little hedgehog scuttling along the hedge, in the same direction. And I thought, gosh, it's like Noah's Ark, stories from when I was a kid.
Mm,
And so I went outside and walked in the direction they were coming from. And down the end of my lane, um, there was this, across the road, which is like a one car country road, there was this thicket of a field on the other side, which was like, Snow White's impenetrable wall of
mm,
thorns, like nothing could get in. And it was about an acre, and it was full of life, and full of native plants and trees and emerging healing ecosystem. And somebody had got planning permission to build a house at the top of the land, and they'd gone in with a digger to clear the whole thing out to make a garden without any thought for the creatures that called it home. And I stood there absolutely horrified and realized I'd done this myself so many times, and that I had everything upside down, do you know?
mm,
And so I thought, where are these wild creatures supposed to go? They can't go out into our agricultural landscapes because they're poisoned. Um, and the habitats are being reefed out at the rate of knots because farmers um, are not supported to do anything else really. And um, they can't go into our gardens because they're filled with non-native plants, which are not part of the local food web, and they're very kind of tidy, and tidy spaces don't really allow life to
mm.
exist. and
And more
and so
chemicals.
and
Mm,
more chemicals, so many. And um and then they can only exist in these tiny wild places, which we don't value, and we just see as opportunities to turn into something else. And
mm,
so I realized then, as I researched it, that nature has collapsed already in Ireland and England and Scotland and Wales and many parts of the world. Nature has already collapsed. The ecosystems here are gone, really. We're just clinging on. They're clinging on. And um, you know, we've lost 70% of the wildlife on this planet since 1970. And
Goodness.
that's no coincidence that that's when the aptly named Green Revolution came in
Mm.
agriculture, the chemical model for industrial farming and forestry and fishing, which is killing everything on the planet, really. And so I kind of went inside and I decided I have to do something to change this. So I started a movement called We Are the Ark, acts of restorative kindness to the earth, in case anybody thought it wasn't like some kind of a religious organization. It's not. It's it's a movement, and it has gone all over the world. And people are simply asked if they can to give as much of their land as they can back to nature, um, and to restore her native plant communities as much as they can, and put up a sign saying this is an ark, so that your neighbors don't helpfully come around and spray it for you or something, which happens a lot. And and basically to shift the consciousness and create a patchwork quilt of hope for our wildlife, which we are hopelessly and completely dependent upon their existence in abundance for our continued existence on this planet, you know.
Mm. Oh wow. I feel so moved by everything you've just shared. I'm just taking a moment to really, when I first came across you and your work, reading, I think it was actually the introduction to your book had been kind of put as an interview in Watkins magazine.
Ah,
And as soon as I began reading this, I was like, oh my goodness, this is for those of us that have a deep connection with the land. Um, so I'll speak for myself. I was kind of like, this is so interesting. It's like I've seen so much of this, but there's something in the way that you're talking about this that kind of landed for me in this like, oh my goodness, this is so what's needed and so important and something that somehow we're not talking about. And it kind of like what you've just hearing you say it again now, it almost lands to me as like quite shocking that we've been so conditioned not to see this, like what we're creating with our gardens. Um, it's quite mind blowing again for even those of us that have a deep connection with the land, with the wild. How, and for me personally, like we've consciously left quite large areas of our garden wild, real intention, and not used any chemicals. But even then, I was like, you can see that there was how can I put this? I don't think I actually really realized how important it was. And I think there was part of me that almost was still looking at that land with a bit of an eye of like, perhaps it's a bit of a shame that we've left it that way. And even though it was intentional, it's like strange how the conditioning still comes back in, where every now and again I'd look at it, maybe we shouldn't be leaving it like that. Um, and it was when I read that interview, I was just like, oh my goodness, like, isn't it strange that I'd been having those thoughts when like this, us all doing a version of this is the way forward and it makes a difference. I think that's what I really saw in your book and in your film. It's like it does actually make a difference. Everyone, like, however much land they can allow to, give back to the wild, it makes a difference. And there was, which I'd like to get into kind of the practicalities, because there were things that I took from, I've got your recent book, and there were really practical advice in there. I was like, oh, I can do that to make this even more helpful to nature, that I'd like to get into. But I think what I'd like to do is start with, because of the work that we do at Wake the Wild, a lot of it is about ultimately healing and change, which ultimately sort of starts with ourselves and then is kind of expressed out there in our lives, including in our gardens and our families and communities. And one of the things that often can really get in the way is when something creates a lot of shame, you know, when we feel this sense of like, I don't even want to look there because it just feels so shaming. And so I wondered your thoughts on that when you're speaking about the work you do,
Hmm.
whether you notice like people almost like can't bear to be in the conversation because of their own like, oh, I feel so bad about the fact that, you know, my garden is the way it is and I actually want to keep it the way it is. So I'd love
Yeah.
to know before we even have the conversation, I would love to know your thoughts in terms of like what you've seen helps people start to open to this way of thinking and looking at the land that they're lucky enough to be custodians of.
Um, what brings them to, like, what brings them to
So yes, it wasn't a
understand that they
particularly
need
clear
to do it?
conversation. More, yeah, what do you feel, I guess there's two questions maybe here. Do you notice that resistance coming up in terms of people almost like, oh, I don't even want to look at this whole idea of giving back the land? Like what do you notice about that comes up for people? And then conversely, what have you noticed like opens people up to starting to think about their gardens differently?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of shame involved, which is why we say to everyone, make a sign. And we're not selling anything. We is me, like I say we, but I'm not selling anything. So, you know, find a piece of old wood or something that you can make a sign on and put it up in your garden to explain that it's now an ark. And that removes that shame because it lets people know that you're doing something important and it immediately removes it. Now, the thing is that it doesn't have to be shameful, like it can be beautiful. It's just that it's just the intention is different. So, like, you know, you still create paths and create areas for yourself. You just don't take any more than you need, you know,
Mm,
and everything can become habitat. And so your edgings, you know, what you do with the ground, you don't drag stone from halfway across the world to pave your ark. You know, you kind of try and work locally and work with the local seed bank and with the local genetic population of plants. And um, but it's different. It's not about you know, people can be a little bit ashamed, especially in places like, you know, the States where you're not allowed to do anything different. Um, especially if you have a homeowners association, people are very restricted, you know.
oh,
Um,
mhm,
but even in all those organizations, there are people who are open to change, you know. So it's really about pushing for change. And the thing that seems to really get people on board is if you care about the planet. It's a stupid question. Like if you care, if you care about the planet, if you really want to be part of a movement that is part of the solution to what we're doing, what we've done, then you've got to start with your own patch of it, or else you're just talking rubbish, you
mm,
know. And I think people get that, you know, start with your own patch of this planet
mm,
and heal that bit. And then you can start moving out from there. And that seems to people get that, like they get that. They suddenly realize that, oh yeah, this is a bit of this whole earth that I'm trying to protect. And the environmental
mm,
movement is extremely conducive to anxiety because, you know, changing your light bulbs or, you know, going along with the whole recycling more and more plastic, which really was just invented to allow them to keep making the stuff, really, you know,
mm,
um, the we really need to do something which gives us heart because um, people have lost heart. And that's the thing about building an ark, you know, no matter how small your land, um, you have to try, you have to, what happens is that you restore hope in your own heart because how quickly nature recovers and how
mm,
desperate the creatures are. And they'll all turn up overnight in your land, even before anything really has happened, because it's almost like the land knows you've given it back. There's a sigh of relief, and
mm.
suddenly all these creatures turn up. It's just amazing. Like it is quite weird. the way they just turn up. Like if you bring a drone up above my land, like here, I'm surrounded by industrial agriculture and, you know, commercial woodland on one side. And, you know, there's nothing living in those places. And the amount of life here is phenomenal, you know. I have everything from lizards to buzzards to badgers and foxes and dragonflies and frogs, you know, everything. It's just amazing. Like we're missing like the wolves and the lynxes and the bears, and you know, I don't have deer here, but so we have to step in and become those creatures and carry out the services that the land is missing because of their absence. And that's why arcing is not like rewilding. Rewilding needs 1,500 acres or more, you know, to have a proper system in place where a restored ecosystem with all the different creatures involved, you know. But arcing, as we call it, can be done in a windowsill, you know, or a balcony or a tiny garden, and you can do whatever you can. And what happens is you restore a connection with nature because you're actually looking after her. And so every spider or worm or bird that comes to share your patch of the planet becomes part of your family, and your heart opens up to include them. And so you become incredibly protective of them. And then when you leave your ark, you just see all the lost opportunities everywhere. All your neighbors' pristine gardens that cost an absolute fortune for some ridiculous reason, because we're all chasing some experience of nature. So we spend more and more money on our landscapes to try and create it, when actually you need to spend nothing. You need to shift your intention into one of guardian instead of gardener. And then you actually restore a connection and you feel better. And that hole in your heart starts to fill in, you know, because we've cut our connection with the earth beneath our feet. We're walking on plastic shoes, we're, you know, rubber soled shoes, we're, you know, we never touch the earth. We're spaced out, like, you know. And so it's very simple to fix that and grow your own food. And so that's the other part of arcing, is growing your own food if you can, or supporting local regenerative organic growers, because everything has to become local. Like the solutions are local, the destruction is local, and the solutions can be local too, you know.
Yeah, I love this so much because I think there is a real practical, accessible element to this idea of arcing, but I really feel what you're talking about, and have absolutely experienced this personally, that it's actually what it allows us to reclaim as humans, that birthright of that just deep interconnection with everything around us. It's that's part of it that's a kind of unseen, but probably, the most precious benefit of all. It starts to reconnect us back to our hearts. And it's such a genius idea. And I love, at some point in the book, you spoke of it like almost like I think you used the language of almost like a patchwork, of arcs. And ultimately they start to connect up, they start to, even however small they are, as they grow, they do create this sense of like islands of places that it is safe for nature to come back to. And I can, that feels doable to me. That does feel like something that we can actually create between us.
Yeah, I agree. That is the thing, because otherwise it's all overwhelming. You know, what, like it's overwhelming. But if each of us that has any land under our care gives it back and supports it to become its true nature, then there is hope. I mean, the interconnectivity is really important, the islandization of land and habitats is a major problem. I mean, you can drive, I don't know, 200 kilometers in Ireland between Dublin and, I don't know, just say Waterford. And that's two different counties. And the whole way along the motorway, there is a huge concrete bollard which divides the two counties in half. Like Carlow and Waterford are completely separate, and wildlife cannot get across the road
Goodness.
for that whole stretch. And that's typical of our lack of understanding of our place in nature, which is actually to become the spiders at the center of this web and reweave the whole thing back together. And this absolute dominion over nature that we have extended over millennia has, you know, it was understandable maybe at the beginning, but at this point, no. I mean, we're at the edge of a cliff and we're all being pushed over it. And so we can't stop the corporate powers or the political puppets of those corporations. We can't stop them. We can only do what we can do. And if enough of us shift and take back our power and create really strong communities and, you know, restore health to every bit of this land we can, I'm pretty sure it'll shift the consciousness in our favor. Like, you know, there's I read that there's estimates of between 3.14, which is pi, and 20% of the population needs to shift their understanding before the whole consciousness shifts instantly. And so that's not too bad. Like we could probably do that, you know. And it's funny because when you come over to our side of the fence, right, you look back and you wonder, what in God's name was that all about? Gardens, like, what was, like, now I look at them and I just think, gosh, that's just shocking. Like, but it's only shocking because I'm over here. Like, I was part of that world for so long, and you know, I was trying so hard to create beauty. I mean, what the hell does that matter? Like, you know, I mean, nature's true nature's true self is beautiful, true beauty, like, and not
Yes.
some version of it that we all have, which is all different. Everyone's version of beauty is different. But, you know, I mean, women are tired of having to fit into a box, the same box that we're putting land into, you know? Like like land is, the earth is the embodiment of the feminine, you know, and we only value land and women if they're pretty or productive. And we don't allow the land to develop into a mature state. Like, women are not allowed to mature, you know. We have to hold ourselves, or try and hold ourselves in a particular state in order to be considered valuable, you know. And land is the same. We punish it, we maintain it, you know, we keep going in and cutting it back to make sure it doesn't change, you know, it stays the same, so that when the neighbors call around, that, you know, it looks pretty, or whatever version of what we're doing. Like, to just the amount of money spent on maintaining land and the amount of chemicals sprayed upon the earth just to keep it the way we think it should be. Like, if we just set it free, it's such a big ask for people to think about. But if they start to understand the collapse of nature and how shifting baseline syndrome has them not really understanding what's going on, you know. And that's that concept that with every passing generation, there is less and less of an understanding of what nature looks like, really, you know, how abundant she used to be. Like, you know, I mean, I always use this idea of how my dad used to tell me stories of how the sun used to get blocked out by swarms of migrating butterflies, you know, and the flocks of migrating birds, or how the waves in the ocean, if you were swimming in them, there'd be fish hopping all around you, like, you know. The rivers were hopping with life, and you know, the sound of birdsong was deafening. And if you drove like your car at nighttime, you know, the windscreen would be covered in dead bugs at the end of it. Bugs, an American term, but you know, insects at the end of it. And now you'd like barely see any.
But yes, I remember seeing that in your book, and I was like, my goodness, like, in my lifetime, that's changed. And I hadn't noticed it had changed. It was when I read that, I'm like, my goodness, yes. I mean, it was quite upsetting seeing so many insects killed on the windscreen, but it was kind of more upsetting realizing that they weren't there to even be killed. It's a weird way of putting it, but
I
yeah, that
know,
really
but
stood
I mean, insects and native plant communities are the foundation stone of all life on Earth, and we've lost 80% of the insects. 80%, like,
Wow,
and
goodness
you know
me.
the understanding is when they go, we have about 4 months to live, all of us. Like, that's
Wow.
it. So, I mean, surely this is the most important work of
Mm,
all of our generation, and all of those generations that exist right now. You know, there is no more important issue than having a livable planet, because none of the other issues will matter if we don't have a life.
no.
You know,
Yeah.
what else is there to be doing? Like, I know everybody
Mm,
has stuff to be dealing with, and everybody has serious issues, and people have kids that need a lot of care, or they might not have good health or any of that stuff. But we still have them. We have this place to be here and to exist in, and we won't if we don't take this on. Like, and
mm.
corporations aren't going to take this on because they don't. I don't know what planet they think they're going to live on. Like, I wish they would all go and live on Mars and leave us alone. Like. But but they, you know, it's not going to work that easily. We really have
Mm.
to fight for every patch of this planet.
Yeah,
We have
it
to fight
really,
hard.
mm, it
We
comes
need to,
back as ever to ourselves, doesn't it, and what we can do.
yeah,
But
pretty
there
much.
is, I think for me, that it's is healing ourselves as much as it is healing the land. They just happen to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
That's very much how I see it. So for listeners that are starting to have a sense of like, oh, okay, maybe this is something that's for me to do, how would you suggest people get started? I mean, I know for us this was, when we moved in where we currently live 10 years ago, and the people before us just I think they just like covered everything with chemicals. In short, like there was just no signs of any life. We found gallons and gallons of weed killer in the shed, so it was kind of just like obliterating all signs of any. I mean, there wasn't even very, very many typical garden plants. It was just, as kept as low maintenance as possible. And so the first thing we did was just not continue to use things like that. And like you said, like how fast things recovered was incredible. Within months, it felt like there was just all this life back in the garden. And then, as I say, over the years, we've intentionally thought, okay, well, we don't need that part. We'll let that part go wild. Which I'd like to get into kind of what I've seen over the years with that. But what would you say is kind of those like first stepping stones back to giving the land back that people can begin with?
But first of all, I'd do nothing and I'd observe your land and get to know
Hmm.
it a little bit. Put up a sign because, just to avoid the neighbors coming in and helping. And then I'd get to know it. I'd look at where the wet patches are, see what plants are coming up. Um, like, we do mirror the earth, right? So, the earth is like a great big heart. And when we started looking at her in terms of ownership instead of in terms of guardianship, the heart shattered into millions of tiny pieces, and it's still breaking, and it's our job to take each of those pieces and meld it back together. But it's funny, it's like I don't really understand why, but each of those little patches of broken heart they all have different types of damage and different requirements of healing and different personalities and characters, and
Mm,
we are drawn to the same. We are drawn to places that require the same types of healing that we do ourselves. And
mm.
like you said, that's how it works, and that was the understanding of all our ancestors as well. And um the good thing about that is, as you start to restore your land back to its true nature and its true health, your own health will come back into alignment, and you will find support to be who you truly are as well. And it all happens on a kind of a magical esoteric level, but it does happen. um the other thing is that people talk about how all the herbs you need for your own health grow outside your back door as
Mm.
such. And that's because they're the same herbs that the land is throwing up to heal herself in that place. So it's very interesting. You can start looking at what's coming up and start researching what it does for health and in humans as well, and see if it has any relationship to what you need, you know. Um,
Mm.
but I suppose it's about creating as many layers of ecosystem as possible. And that means some bare earth, you know, to allow the annual weed seeds to come out. A mown area which would have, you know, been the grazed by the large herbivores. You know, an arc meadow which is allowing the wild herbs come out of the seed bank and come up. Um, and then you'd have a scrubby area which is all thorns and shrubs, all native plants, you know, and they come up as well, brambles and hawthorns and blackthorns, depending on what part of the world you're in, of course, it's different. And then you've got your woodlands and your emergent woodlands and your mature woodlands and all the communities of plants. So it's not about planting trees. People have this thing about plant trees, plant trees, plant trees. Number one, it's ecologically, everything is locally adapted. So, you know, it's really about supporting um, the land itself to restore itself. If there isn't any seed bank left after so much damage, yeah, you have to bring in maybe pocket forests that are allowed to spread, or you know, if you can find seeds of trees that are local and old,
Mm.
um, that sort of thing. Um, but yeah, and then you within that you create as many different supports for life as you can, like water. Like it's very hard for wildlife to find a good source of water these days because, you know, all our waters are polluted, and you know we've done so much damage. So, you know, 90 something like 50% of all the little ponds were filled in here in Ireland anyway, to make more land for agriculture. And probably a
Mm.
lot more than 50% really. And 87% of all the wetlands were filled in. But you can see them on Google Maps images. You see these little dark patches in the land. And if you've got clay soil, then you really know you have one. And if you dig it out, all the microbiome is still present for that pond to restore
Oh,
itself, you
wow.
know.
Mm.
And so I've done that here, and it's amazing what's come out, you know. Um, and that's brilliant. But even if you've only got a bowl of water sunken into the ground, filled with rainwater and some rocks to allow creatures in and out, that's going to be good, you know.
Mm.
Um, with some, you know, now even stagnant water is important because it gets filled with larvae. But if you can't do the stagnant water, and you want to have a bigger pond, you know, make sure you put in some native water plants to oxygenate it, some barley straw, that kind of thing. Yeah, so that's it really. It's very simple. We have a very simple breakdown on how to do all this work on the website, wearetheark.org, you know, and the
Mm.
information is all there and it's free. And the book just backs it up and gives a lot more detail because people don't like reading websites really. But that's it. It's very simple. So one of the things that I think really destroys the hope of the earth to come back to herself is this narrative we've been fed, which is that if you plant pollinator friendly plants in your garden, that you're helping. And that's a garden industry supportive narrative. It's not a nature
Mm.
supportive narrative. And in that classic way of the old version of conservation where it focused in on one particular species and didn't think about everything else,
Mm.
that's kind of similar to this, but it's worse because yes, if you put like, you know, these non-native single open flowered plants in your gardens, you will get a lot of insects visiting because um, it gives them a lot of food. It's not a whole food, but it's a food. It's a bit like a fast food restaurant in your
Mm.
garden, you know. And the thing is, we call them fast food flowers now because what happens is that because the insects ignore the native, more insignificant plants because they've been given this kind of really tasty food, those self like the the native plants have formed relationships with the insects over millennia, and plants are really good at protecting themselves. They're filled with chemicals, right? They don't want to be eaten. So insects lay their eggs on plants, right? And those insects have focused all their attention to evolve to eat one or maybe two different species of plant because they've learned to adapt to the chemicals in those plants. And if those plants aren't present, then those insects don't get to create a new generation of their own species.
Mm.
So the plant communities collapse. They start to retreat. And then the insects, yeah, they get a great feed, brilliant, but they can't lay their eggs anywhere because those plants
Mm.
aren't present. And so that's a major problem because those larvae are the basis of the food web for almost all small mammals and birds, and
Mm.
like birds don't feed their young seeds, they feed them larvae and spiders, and hedgehogs, foxes, even shrews, all these little creatures, they spend all their attention focusing on eating larvae. So yeah, it's a bit of a problem because people feel like they don't really have to change because they're helping by planting those plants, and that's not helpful.
That blew my mind. It really was when I was like, oh my goodness. It makes so much sense now. I've heard you say it, but it is something again that we've been so trained out of seeing the truth of what we're doing with our gardens. You kind of really need someone to say like no, this thing that you've been told helps is actually just another form of hindrance.
Exactly.
I think that's a really important one. um we're almost out of time. One final thing I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, because this has been certainly a journey for me personally, is witnessing the land that we've given back to the wild, how it's kind of gone through these different phases where at times it literally just looked like completely all stinger nettles, and like we can't just leave, all of this to stinger nettles. But as we've kind of like been patient and just watched what's happening over time, all different other species have come back, and now it's kind of there's all sorts of things there, like really surprised, like how on earth did that land there? But it's really to say it's been 10 years now for that to happen, and really like spending time watching and just allowing it to do its own thing. But there's certainly been times where it has just looked like this isn't really like, can this actually be helpful, just this huge area covered in stinging nettles. But I'd love to hear your like what you've seen and what's helpful for people to know about that as that kind of the time needed, and what typically will happen as that time goes by.
It's not typical at all. It's different for every patch of the planet. So
Mm.
I can't tell you what's going to happen. I just know
Ah.
that people need to step in and remove any non-native plants that
Mm.
emerge, particularly, especially the non-native invasive plants. And I often hear this narrative that the earth the earth knows what she's doing by bringing those plants into a place. And I'm sorry, that's not the case. We've done too much damage. Creatures can't evolve fast enough for the changes we've imposed upon them. And those plants have escaped from gardens, and
Mm.
they don't have any checks and balances in this part of the world that they're running rampant in, and they collapse ecosystems everywhere because nothing
Mm.
else can survive around them because they're so successful. And
Yes, there's
so
a
they
huge
really,
rhododendron bush there's like a natural woodland just up the road from me, and there's like huge rhododendrons just like completely taken over. I mean, it's quite shocking to see. But really I think on is kind of like a exaggerated version of what's happening at a mini level in so many gardens, isn't it?
yeah. And like rhododendrons, um, it creates, it poisons the bees that go to feed from them. And, you know, they're one of the major problems of ecosystem collapse in Ireland, rhododendron ponticum.
Really?
They've taken over completely in large parts of west of Ireland, and even here near the east of Ireland where I live. And each plant produces over 1 million seeds, and they're so successful that they they drown out everything else that comes underneath them, you know, and it just um sorry, they drown out any life or light underneath them, you know. So basically it's a totally different world when those non-native invasives take over. And so without the native plant communities, the whole system collapses, and there's no support there for wildlife to live. So, you know, the world can become one big garden, or it can become a sanctuary for life. And so we need to take all those creatures out. And it's tough work because they're all sentient beings, like, but they have to be removed. You know, it just has to be done, you know, easily, just gently, you know.
Yeah.
It's hard work, and it's hard work to do on large pieces of land, but you can do it in the small patches of the planet that we look after ourselves. You know, you can manage it without chemicals, preferably, you know.
Yes.
Just, you know, if you can. Yeah.
Wonderful. One last thing that was, again, one of those really simple things, but it was just like, oh, of course, when I saw it in the book, was allowing, you know, places that small animals can get from kind of outside of the garden into the garden, or from one garden into another, and kind of creating, you know, spaces at the bottom of fences. I kind of went and had a look immediately after. I was like, oh, actually, thankfully, there are quite a few spaces like that, but it's something that just hadn't occurred to me before that. So is there anything you'd like to say particularly on that?
Sure, connectivity between arcs is really important. I mean, right now we can't do anything about roads. Eventually, when I think we'll be looking back in 5 years' time, wondering why we didn't throw out the rule book, and I think we'll start to retrospectively. I think cars will become less of an issue, because I think people are going to have to return to living locally. And I don't mean in those weird 15-minute cities. I mean living locally, and having a shit hot public transport system, which actually allows us to go anywhere we want. But at the moment, people have to have cars, you know, because they can't get anywhere without them generally. And but within gardens and arcs, what we need to do is open up the boundaries and replace walls with living hedges. And if you can't take down walls, then to create little tunnels underneath them safely, or create little gaps in fences to allow creatures to pass through, because their territories are massive. Like, you know, they're not these tiny, like, they don't just live here. They live, like, a hedgehog has a 10-acre territory, you know, or and like, say, like, just consider the territories that they have to have, and try and connect, you know, connect with your neighbors and explain to them what you're doing. And generally they won't have a problem with you creating a tiny little gap. You know, it only needs to be a CD case size for hedgehog, like, or, you know, whatever. It's just to understand that, you know, we don't own this earth. We don't own these patches of the earth. It's kind of a funny concept, the fact that we think we own anything, really. You know, we're only here for a moment, literally. She breathes in, we're born. She breathes out, we die. You know, we're only here for a moment, like. But the way the system that we live in, you know, each patch of land has an owner as such, and so that means you can protect it, and you can try and create connections from there to other places which are being protected, you know, and that's a very important part of the process. So that's it. Thanks for having me, Lian.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been just I'm so happy to be able to have this conversation and share it with listeners, because I think this is something we can actually do, but it does make a difference. So where can listeners find out more about you and your book and your website and all of your wonderful work? Where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, sure. You can go to wearetheark.org or marymary.ie. Yeah, but loads of places out there. Really, you can just Google it. There's an awful lot of it. There's a Facebook group, if people are on that medium, whatever you call it, called We Are the Ark, and it's filled with people who have arcs all over the world, and they're brilliant at giving advice. So that would be great, one way of doing it. And then, yeah, that's what I would suggest. Thank you so much, Lian.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for everything you do. Really appreciate you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.